Today's daf we're going to be learning is daf lamed bet. This is the daf for Friday. I will point out that tomorrow's daf, the Shabbat daf, is very, very short. The reason is because we don't know why, but in one of the earlier printings, not even the more recent printing, which isn't so recent, but it's called from the widow and the Achim Ram, a widow and her whole story about that. For another time, you could research it. But the main point is that even before them, which is called the Tfus Venezia, that was done in Venice, they already printed, for some strange reason, Tosfos from Daf 31 and 32 on page 33. And if you look ahead for a minute, you'll see 33 has 6 lines, mostly Tosfos around it. And on 33b, it's all Tosfos. There's no Gemara there. This is the only place where I believe where this happens. Definitely the shortest daf in the Gemara. And for our luck, it came out on Shabbat this time. So we're gonna be able to learn that daf very quickly, and that's just good to know in terms of the Shabbat daf. So let's get started. Today's daf is sponsored by Sarah Zahavi in honor of her sister Chasya and her love for learning. Today's daf is sponsored by Hindi Herman in memory of her dear mother, Ethel Bachayim, on her yahrzeit. Today's daf is sponsored by Linda Friedman in memory of her father, Leon Pullman, on his 8th yahrzeit, husband of Thelma Pullman and father of Linda, Sheila, and Gwen. Dad had a special love of learning about Jewish history and our people. May his neshama have an aliyah. Today's daf is sponsored by Amy Goldstein in memory of her father, Melvin Goldstein, on his 3rd yahrzeit. Only now that you are gone am I understanding the wisdom of your ways. Okay, we're going to get started with our Gemara. We had the first line of the Mishna from yesterday is the one we're going to talk about right now. It was Mishna Nadal ben Nazir ben Sha'al Lecham Ba'asaro Moneh Misha'ah Shanadal. Someone who takes on to be a Nazir and then goes to try to undo his vow. But what you're missing here is, it seems to be clear, certainly in the Gemara, that the person drank wine during those days, some of those days, and the Chacham forbids it. Moneh Misha'ah, and as he doesn't allow, he says, I'm not letting you undo this vow just because you drank wine. That's not a good reason to undo the vow. Moneh Misha'ah Shanadal. But his nazirut starts from day 1, meaning even though he drank wine some of the days, it still counts as part of his days, because the Torah says, if you become impure to a dead body, then you go back and count from the beginning. It doesn't say that about anything else. So that's the way Tanakama seems to understand it. To which the Gemara, now starting at the top of Daf Lamed Bet, Mani Matnitin, lo Rabbi Yosi v'lo Rabbanit. The Mishna doesn't seem to follow any of these 2 opinions that we know about that relate to this issue. So now we're going to quote a bright. It seems to relate to this issue. We assume if there's 2 opinions, that must be all there is. So if our Mishna doesn't fit with any of them, there seems to be some difficulty here. To which the Gemara quotes this bright. Ditanya. Misha Nadal va'avar naziruto ein niskakin lo. Okay, ein niskakin lo means we don't allow him to undo his vow, like our Mishnah says. And not only that, but he has to bring sacrifices. But when do you bring the sacrifices? Ela in ken moneh behem isul kayamim shanag be'metel. You have to complete your days of nazirut without drinking wine. So if you took on for 100 days and 60 of those days you were drinking wine, you have to add another 60 days before you can bring your sacrifices. So number 1, you can't undo your vow. Number 2, you have to add all these extra days. That's clearly not our Mishnah. Our Mishnah said, right, that there's no issue. You can just count from the beginning. Rabbi Yosi omer dayosh l'shim yom. It's enough 30 days. What does he mean by this? It means that you have to have 30 days of nazirut where you weren't drinking wine. So if you took on a 30-day nazirut, you're obviously going to have to be like Tanakama and make sure you do enough days that were with nazirut, without drinking wine. But if it was 100 days, and let's say 60 days you drank wine, but you still have 40, then you're fine. As long as you have a minimum of 30 days, doesn't matter how long your nazirut was, it's fine. To which the Gemara says, okay, so Rabbanan, now here there's a problem. First of all, I should just tell you that Dayosh L'Shim Yom there's a big debate about how exactly to understand it. I gave you one interpretation. So just so you should know, there's different opinions about how to read this and what it means and all that. But basically, the Gemara is now going to go off, and there's a problem with the nusach, and it's because the questions are not 100% clear-cut. It's not a perfect explanation, not perfectly smooth, but we'll go with the version that doesn't appear in the text here. We'll go with the opposite. If we go with the rabbis, then we're going to have a problem with a longer period of nazirut, which means really even a longer period, meaning both a short period and a long period. Because in a short period, the rabbis are going to say you need to have 30 complete days without wine. And Tanakama, our Mishnah doesn't say that. And if it's a long nazirut, also it's going to be a problem, because in a long nazirut, you're still going to have to redo all those days. And Tanakama, our Mishnah says no. Rabbi Yosi kasha nazirut mu'etet. Okay, it says merubah here, but many fix it to say mu'etet. With Rabbi Yosi, the difficulty is going to be in a short nazirut, because in a long nazirut, Rabbi Yosi might not need you to make up any days, because as long as you have 30 that you weren't drinking wine, you're fine. And then it would match Tanakama. So the problem would be in a short nazirut, where it's less than 30 days, since you're going to need at least 30 days without wine, you're going to have to add days. So basically, we have an issue. I'm not going to read the sugya the other way. There's two ways to read the sugya, but we're going to go with that. So, I can now explain it both according to Rabbi Yosi and Rabbanan. So we started off with the question, doesn't seem to match either. To which the Gemara answers, we can explain it according to one, or we can even explain it according to the other. How so? Obviously, you're going to have to do some adjustments. So, the Mishna is if you have a long period of nizirut, and then you don't need to add any days, and then you can still count from the beginning. That exactly matches Rabbi Yosi, because as long as you have 30, you're fine. And the Braita, where he says you have to add 30, or it's enough to have 30, that was if you had a short period, then you're going to have to add days. That's a pretty reasonable way of explaining it. Of course, our Mishnah never said we were talking about a long period of nizirut, right? So, and that's not the typical. So that's the weakness here. You can explain it all according to the rabbis, because how so? Well, you'd have to change some of the wording. Lo tema misha ashenazal. Now, what did the Mishnah say? Mishnazar ben Nazir ben Asaro. If you tried to undo your neder, the asaroni wouldn't let you. Monet misha ashenazal. His nazirut is counted from the time he took his nazirut upon himself, right? So, meaning no extra days. But if you change misha to elaema kit misha ashenazal, which you add one little letter and it changes the whole thing. Like from the time that you took the neder, you have to count now from the beginning, like when you took the nizirut upon yourself. You have to start from the beginning, okay? Or at least, again, it's not exactly start from the beginning, but it's make sure to have the complete number of days, and then you can change it and it would match the rabbis. So again, the first thing we did was try to figure out who is this unattributed opinion in the Mishnah, which is the only opinion in the Mishnah, and it doesn't seem to follow either of the two opinions that we know. And we had to adjust things a little in order to explain, either by saying one is talking about one case and one is talking about the other, right? The Mishnah and the Braita, or changing a word, which then changes the whole meaning of that line in the Mishnah. Now we're going to go on to the next part of the Mishnah. The next part of the Mishnah had said that, and this is what Beit Hillel uses a question against Beit Shamai. If you remember, yesterday we learned Beit Shamai says hekdesh, by mistake, is hekdesh. And then the Gemara went on to say, but if hekdesh is hekdesh, then Beit Hillel says to Beit Shamai, but wait, in the case where you undo, you dissolve your vow of nazirut, and you had already separated an animal, that animal is not sanctified at all. Isn't that by mistake? So now Rabbi Yirmiyahu wants to infer something from our Mishnah. I'm a Rabbi Yirmiyahu. Mi de Beit Shamai nishma le de Beit Hillel. Because Beit Shamai agrees with Beit Hillel about this halacha, right? That it goes back into the herd, the flock, and it's not sanctified at all when you undo your vow. We're going to learn the following. Okay, now we're going to learn something about Beit Hillel. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to make an analogy, okay, and a type of analogy. Lav Amrei Beit Shamai. So we're going to start off our analogy with, does Beit Shamai not say hekdesh b'ta'ud is hekdesh, right? Mistaken hekdesh is effective. And yet, but if we undo the vow from the beginning, and it turns out you were never a Nazir when you separated that animal, so even though Beit Shammai holds hekdesh by mistake is hekdesh, if that were to happen, that you dissolved your nazirut from the beginning, after you separated, you took on nazirut, you separated the animal, you undid it, we basically erase everything that happened, which means also your animal is no longer sanctified. So even though Beit Shammai says hekdesh b'ta'ud is hekdesh, he views this as not hekdesh because this is just, there was no sanctification to begin with. It's a zit, right? Now, apply this to Beit Hillel. When does Beit Hillel agree that a mistake is actually effective? In the case of Tmura. Remember, that was Beit Shammai's whole proof. Just like it works in Tmura, it works here. And then Beit Hillel said no. But le Beit Hillel nami. So now do the analogy. Since Beit Hillel Okay, even though Beit Hillel agrees that when you substitute an animal in place of another one by mistake, meaning you said this animal is in place of my ola, but it turns out it was really a shlem, and you said something incorrectly, it's still effective. The second animal is sanctified. But now we're going to compare the second part of Beit Shamai, where he doesn't think it's effective, and we're going to do the same thing by Tamura and say, if you were to undo what now? That Tamura b'ta'ut works as long as the original animal that was sanctified, that you're now trying to substitute a different one in its place, is in existence. If I say this animal is in place of the first animal, and right, so this is in place of my korban olah, let's say. And I have a korban olah, an animal that I sanctified for my korban olah, and I said this is in place of that. Now again, remember, it doesn't remove the sanctity of the first animal; it just adds sanctity to the second. Again, I always remind you, it's not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to do this, and it's not effective in the sense that it can't be substituted in place of, but both become sanctified. Now, what if? But what if I undid the sanctity on that first animal? Okay, I went to a chacham and I undid it. I said, "Oh, that was someone else. I don't know. I somehow get rid of the sanctity." Eat akar nami tmura. Then the tmura will not be sanctified anymore because it's just like the nazir. Okay, if I undo my nazir from the beginning, then whatever I sanctified in the middle is irrelevant. Very similar to the situation we have where there was one person said I'm a nazir, and then the other one said I'm a nazir because you're a nazir, and then if that person's not a nazir, then the second one is not. Same thing here. So what they're basically doing is saying, since Beit Shammai agrees the hekdesh b'ta'ut is hekdesh, but yet this case is not because you've undone it from the beginning. When Beit Hillel agrees about the tmura case, the tmura b'ta'ut works. It would only be b'ta'ut, a mistake, and not if you undid the sanctity of the first animal. Then the tmura, the second animal, would actually not be sanctified anymore. Okay, very logical. Okay, so that was the second thing we did today. So the first was figuring out who the Tana of the Mishna is. The second was Rabbi Yirmiyahu making this inference about Beit Hillel, about tmura, that's done when you undo the sanctity of the first animal, the second one will no longer be sanctified. Next, we go to the line about Maaser Behem. Amar Mar. So now we go back to a line said earlier. Comes Beit Shamai and says, I'll prove you hekdesh b'ta'ut works because Maaser Behema, right? If you do the 9 and you call it 10 for all your counting, you mess up your count, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 by accident. You say the 9th one will be sanctified. Also, your 10th one will be sanctified, but also the 9th. And if you accidentally do it to the 11 and you skipped a number, you said a number twice, let's say, and your 11th one was called 10, it also becomes sanctified. To which Beit Hillel have responded, it's just exerat katuv, just right. The Torah says so, and it's a unique halacha we don't learn from it. So now the Gemara says, Itmar, we're now going to bring a different machloket about Maaser Behema and try to infer something about it or question one of the opinions from our Mishnah. So Itmar, here's a machloket between a moraim. Maaser, Rav Nachman Amar, ta'uto v'lo kavanato. This 9th becoming sanctified or 11th becoming sanctified by mistake is only by mistake, not if I decided to call the 9th 10th. If I decided intentionally, doesn't work. Mistake, if I did it by mistake, it works. Of course, if I did it with intent, it works. So we have this debate. So now, Amarle Rav Nachman. So now we want to question Rav Nachman from our Mishnah and from what it doesn't say in our Mishnah. Okay, so you said, by mistake, it only works, but it doesn't work with intent. When Beit Shamai comes to say to Beit Hillel, right, when Beit Shamai says to him, don't you agree with me about this, which they do agree, right? And Beit Hillel didn't respond. Now, they did respond, but they didn't respond with a different kind of retort, okay? So now, what they're going to say is Beit Hillel could have responded in a particular way. Okay, if you're right, Rav Nachman, that it's only b'ta'ut and not with intent. Leimru lahom, Beit Hillel could have said, Ma lema'aser sheken eino kadosh b'chavana. You can't prove from Maaser because Maaser is not like hekdesh. Why is Maaser not like hekdesh? Because you can't do it with intent. And hekdesh, of course, you do it with intent. That's how you do hekdesh. You say, I'm intending to make this sanctified. So Amar of Shimi, so basically, from the fact that they don't say that must mean it's not true, because they could have responded that way if you were right, Rav Nachman. Amar of Shimi Barashi, no, we can prove the opposite. it's dafka true. And the reason they didn't say it was because Beit Shamai could have flipped that logic on its head. And Beit Shamai could have said, if they tried to say, Maaser isn't kadosh b'chavana, doesn't that prove you're wrong? Because then it's not like hekdesh. Beit Shamai could have said the opposite. I'll make a kavachomer from this. The kavachomer. Ma maaser she'eno kadosh b'chavana, kadosh b'ta'ut. If you take maaser, which isn't even sanctified when you do it intentionally, meaning if you say 9 is 10, it doesn't work if I really want to make the 9th one the 10th one. Then it's kadosh b'ta'ut. And yet it's sanctified if I do it accidentally. So hekdesh, shekadosh b'chavana lo koshkein. So all the more so, right? If something can't even be done on purpose and yet by accident it works, then obviously something that could be done with intention, when it happens by accident, all the more so it should be sanctified. And that's why Beit Hillel didn't say it, and not because I'm wrong, Rav Nachman says, but because, again, which not Rav Nachman answered, Rishon Rashi is supporting Rav Nachman and saying, if they tried that logical argument, Beit Shammai would have flipped it on its head and used it as his proof. But Velohi, now they just point out it's not the case because the hekdesh b'data demare tali. Hekdesh is all dependent on the intent of the owner. And that's why this logic actually wouldn't really necessarily work, because you can't say just because it works intentionally, it should work by accident, because hekdesh is all dependent on the intent of the owner. And that's why it might not work for Beit Hillel anyway, by mistake. Okay, so there you had this discussion we basically did was we brought in an outside machloket, Rav Nachman and Rav Huna and versus Rav Chis and Rav Huna, about whether Maaser Behema could be done with intention. If you actually purposely chose the 9th to be the 10th, would that be effective or not? And then we tried to disprove knock out one of the sources from what's not said in our Mishnah. And we said, no, he didn't say it's like a game of chess, right? You have to think ahead. If I do that, what will they respond to me, right? So it might look like a really good move, but then the counter move is going to be much more, much worse. So they tried to say it would be a good chess move, and then they say not the smartest move because Beit Shammai could knock that out, and therefore it doesn't prove it. Okay, next. Now we're moving on to a new Mishnah. Okay, so I'll summarize this part and that'll be at the end of our summary for here, which is we started with our Mishnah. We dealt with the first line first about if you don't keep your days of nazirut, you drink wine. Do you have to start from the beginning? It sounded from our Mishnah that you don't have to redo any of those days. We said it doesn't seem to fit in with any of the opinions. We brought 2 answers. One of them actually seems to read our Mishnah differently, that you actually would have to add more days, or you would only, depending on what kind of nazirut it was, if it was long or short. Then we had, right, and which one does it fit with, Rabbi Yosi or the rabbi? Then we had this line of Beit Shamai about the hekdesh b'ta'ut is not hekdesh, but if you undid your vow from the beginning, it actually wouldn't be. And then we tried to prove that to Beit Hillel, it would be the same thing with Tmura. If you undid the kedusha of the first animal, the second animal wouldn't be sanctified anymore. Then we brought this outside machloket of Rav Nachman and Rav Chisda and Rav Huna, Rav Huna and Rav Chisda, and we tried to disprove Rav Nachman from our Mishnah, but we're unsuccessful. New Mishnah. Mishna nadar b'nazir v'halach laviet behemto. So I become a Nazir and I have an animal in my herd that I plan to use. Turns out when I go to bring my sacrifice, the animal is gone, stolen. So now I'm like, oh, I didn't want to do my nazirut. I did it only knowing I had this animal. Now I have to go buy an animal. That wasn't what I was planning. Depends on the order. If I became a Nazir, then it was stolen. I can't undo my vow. Why can't I undo my vow? This is something we learned in Masechet Nedarim. Ein potchim b'nolad. You can't use a petach. One of the things you can't do is say, oh, had I realized that something was going to happen. Now, what does it mean to be nolad? It's something that hadn't happened yet and was unexpected. So to have my animal stolen is quite unexpected and it hadn't happened yet. So that's not a petach that's acceptable in court. Okay, there was actually a debate about it, and we'll talk about that as soon as we get to the Gemara. Rabbi Eliezer actually says you can. The rabbi said you can't. So our Mishnah seems to follow the rabbis, although we'll see later something else about it. But basically, we say, look, since you couldn't have anticipated this and it hadn't happened yet, it's irrelevant. Now turning to Amud Bet. But if first my animal was stolen, I didn't know. I wasn't on top of all my animals. I thought I had this animal. I became a nazirah, assuming I was going to bring that animal to the temple. And then I find out later that the animal was stolen beforehand. Then it's not nolad, because that actually had happened. I didn't know about it, but it's not nolad. So that would work. Now, Eino Nazir is a debate what this means. Does it mean I'm a Nazir by mistake and I'm not a Nazir at all now? In other words, my nazirut wipes out without me doing anything. Some people say that that's the case because I took it on a mistaken impression that I had an animal and it turns out I didn't. Or does it mean I can go to a chacham and undo it? Okay, there's a big difference because either it's just automatically dissolved or I actually have to go to dissolve it, but I can use that as my petach and then that will work. Vizo, here comes the interesting line of today's daf. Vizo ta'ut ta'a Nachum HaMadi. And this Nachum HaMadi was mistaken about. Hisha'alu nezirim min hagolah. When nezirim came from the exile, okay, after the destruction of the temple. And they came, they didn't have communication. They thought that the temple was still there. And they came to Jerusalem to bring their sacrifices at the end of the Nazir time period. Wow, were they in for a surprise? When they get there to bring their sacrifices, there's no temple. What are they supposed to do? Now they're stuck. There's no way out of this nazirut, because if you can't bring your sacrifices, you're not permitted to drink wine, anything else. So, Amar lahem Nachum HaMadi, so he says to them the obvious peta. Had you known the Beit HaMikdash was going to be destroyed, would you have taken upon yourself nazirut? Hamrulo. They said, of course not. Right? We don't want to be a nazir forever. It sounds pretty reasonable. And he permitted them. But how did we start? He made a big mistake here. What was his mistake? Well, when it came to the rabbis, Amru, just like the stolen animal case. If the temple was actually destroyed and they didn't know, and they took on nazirut thinking the temple was still there, then it's fine. Then you can undo the vow because they didn't know. But if the temple was destroyed later, this is nolad. Who expected the temple was going to be destroyed? And therefore, this is something didn't yet happen, and it was unexpected, and therefore, you can't use this as a petah. So they said Nachum HaMadi was wrong in permitting all these nezirim. To which the Gemara first, we're going to leave that case aside for a minute, come back to it in a minute or two. First, we have Rabbi. Rabbi comes in and says, from our Mishna, you can learn. It's a very interesting word, shitfua. Shitfua literally in modern Hebrew means like shtifat moach is what you call brainwashing. Okay, the word moach doesn't appear here, but it's almost like they brainwashed him. In other words, they pulled him over to their side. Okay, how do we know they pulled him over to their side? Because ditnan. First, we want to show there's a machloket. I told you this. Potchim bin nolad, divrei Rabbi Eliezer. In the Mishna, in the Nedarim, Rabbi Eliezer says you can use nolad as a petah. Chachamim osrim, and the assumption here, even though they don't say it, is that Rabbi Eliezer was in the time period when the Churban happened and after. And the fact that the rabbis all went against Nachum HaMadi and he didn't stand up to support Nachum HaMadi, it must be that they convinced him that they were right. And therefore, they infer from our Mishnah that it was everybody agreed against Nachum HaMadi, and or even Nachum HaMadi probably just made a mistake, is what they're saying. Not that he disagreed with them, but they actually think he made a mistake. Apropos all the topics of mistakes and all that. But anyway, Rabbi seems convinced that Rabbi Eliezer must have changed sides. Which again, I'm saying it like this because it's not 100% clear from the Mishnah that he changed his mind, but they assume that he changed his mind. Now we ask another question, another point. Amar Rava, af al gav de amar Rabbanit ein potchim b'nolad, aval potchim b'tnai nolad. Rava comes and says, by the way, and this is very difficult to explain exactly the differences, or to understand, not to explain, but to understand exactly the differences. Even though you don't use nolad, there is a way you can use nolad. You can start making a stipulation about nolad. What does that mean? Hechidami, the Gemara doesn't even really know what he means, so they ask, what's the case? And the answer, Amre lahom, they say to them, if people would have come to you, you might remember this, in Nedarim we had the same thing. They said, if 10 men come up to you and say the following, and told you this, would you have done it? So they can use that to override the nolad issue. If people had come to you, they say, and told you, Beit HaMikdash, the Beit HaMikdash is going to be destroyed. Mi hava nazirite, would you have taken the vow? And if they say no, then that would actually work. So how this is different from nolad is not 100% clear. And I can just tell you that, again, when you have this kind of structure, where somebody says something and then the Gemara it's later the Stam Gemara that's trying to figure out who's the one who said this, right? It's not 100% clear who said it. So it becomes more challenging because, it's not clear what he said. So the Gemara is already trying to figure it out and they come up with an answer. It's not necessarily clear that's what Rava actually meant, but somehow you can, according to the Gemara's explanation of Rava, it's that you kind of add this, the people, and people had told you this, would you have done it? And if he says no, then you can undo it. But now here comes the big line, which there's two extra shiurim today on the site, one from Rabbanit Clymer in Machshava Shniya and Gefet from Rabbanit El Shimoni, both on this next line and really the Mishna in general, and the story of Nachum HaMadi. Amar Rav Yosef, Rabbi Yosi says, in hindsight, right? So it's easy to say, if I was there, I would have said this. Doesn't it say this pasuk about the sanctuary of God 3 times? This is a reference to the first temple and the second temple, and the fact that this second temple will be destroyed as well. Okay, so first of all, the pasuk says, "Al tibtechu lachem al divrei hasheker lemor hechal Hashem hechal Hashem hechal Hashem hema." Don't believe these Nevi'ei Sheker, Yirmiyahu says. We're telling you, the sanctuary of God, the sanctuary of God, the sanctuary of God is here. Okay, meaning he's trying to tell them that Korban is coming. So basically, and then there's all sorts of drashot about this pasuk, and that's part of what Rabbi goes on about. And anyway, there's a lot more to be said on this. I'm going to keep going though in our daf. But the assumption here, the basic assumption of the pshat, again, there's a lot more for in-depth learning, and both of them are more in the kivun of the philosophical nature of what's going on here, about people anticipating the destruction, etc. There's a lot more to be said. Anyway, Rav Yosef says, what do you mean? They knew the destruction was coming. How could you say they didn't know it was coming? I was telling them it was coming. Which the Gemara answers, no, that wouldn't have worked. Because even though they knew it was going to be destroyed, nobody knew when it was going to be destroyed. To which Amar Abai, what do you mean? What do you mean they didn't know when it was going to be destroyed? It's said in the pasuk, right? It's an interesting assumption. Everyone believes everything the prophets say, which we know already. Not everyone believed the prophets, but v'haktiv shvuim shivim nechtach alamcha v'alir kadshecha. Pasuk from Daniel. It says 70 Shavuot. Now, Shavuot means 7-year cycles, 77-year cycles, which means 490 years will be between the first and second destruction. So they knew, right? It was Nechtach Alam Chavali 490 years. That's what's going to be, that's when you're going to have the next destruction. So they knew when it was going to be. To which they say, so basically, if they were taking a neder in that year, they should have anticipated. To which they answer, which is interesting in terms of what one should anticipate, still, they didn't know what day. Hey, they weren't sure what day was going to come out. Maybe they could be a Nazir for 30 days and the destruction still won't happen. It's also a matter, and this is something a little bit Rabbanit El Shimoni talks about, how optimistic you're going to be, right? In other words, do you think maybe you have power to push off the inevitable, right? The destruction theoretically could have been avoided. So anyway, all sorts of interesting things about there. I'm leaving that for the other shiurim. So basically what we did with this Mishna is we talked about the issue of nolad. We tried to show that it seems that everyone agrees in the end, not only Rabbi Eliezer, but everyone agrees in the end that ain potchim b'nolad, and that's why if your animal was stolen, it depends when it was stolen. If the Beit Mikdash was destroyed, it depends when you took your vow. If you took your vow before, then it's not going to work as peta, and then you're basically stuck, right? Which is interesting. Rav Yosef, I think, is also trying, when he tries to come up, he tries to say, like, why didn't they try to help these people, right? You think about their situation, they're really stuck. They're going to be Nazir forever, which is not what they were intending, So maybe also he's saying we should have tried to find a way out. Tries to find a way out, but the Gemara rejects his options because he said, no, as long as you couldn't have really anticipated, then it's considered nolad, unexpected, right? Hasn't yet happened and unexpected, which again raises all sorts of questions about people living in that time period, what they should have expected, what they shouldn't have expected. Anyway, interesting. Like I said, that's why we have extra in-depth shiurim, so you can go listen to those. They're both not very long. You also have some extra time because Shabbat daf is so short. New Mishnah. This we actually saw yesterday. If they were walking on a path, 6 people in the end, we're going to see we're walking on this path. And they see someone from a distance. I'm so convinced that's so-and-so. And you don't agree with me? I'm so convinced I'm going to take upon this. I'm going to be a Nazir if it's that person. I'm so convinced it's not that person. I'm going to be a Nazir if it's not that person. So one of them theoretically is right and one is wrong. The third one says, I'm going to be a Nazir if one of you becomes a Nazir, which theoretically one of them should be a Nazir. The fourth one says, I'm going to be a Nazir if neither of the two of you are nezirim, which shouldn't really happen, although maybe. I'm going to be a Nazir if both of you are nezirim, which also only one is right. So what's that all about? And the sixth one said, if 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are a Nazir, I'm a Nazir. Okay, or I'm a Nazir, I'm assuming you're all a Nazir. So now we're going to have, okay, you say we need a flow chart, which I could see, right? You might think, but it's actually not so complicated because Beit Shamai omrim kulam nezirim. Beit Shamai says very simply, everyone's a Nazir because they basically took on nezirut, believing they were right. And they were wrong, some of them, but it doesn't make a difference. It's a neder b'ta'ut, and we already said, hekdesh b'ta'ut works, nezirut b'ta'ut also works. Beit Hillel omrim, eino nazir ela misha lo nitkaimu dvarav. The only one who's a Nazir is the one who, the only ones who will be a Nazir is the ones, here comes the very strange part, whose words don't come true. It should be the opposite, whose words do come true, because they said, I'm going to be a Nazir if that is Ploni. I'm going to be a Nazir if that's not Ploni, which means if they're right, their word should come, they should be a Nazir, not if they're wrong. Gemara is going to deal with that. Rabbi Tarfon omer einacha mehem Nazir. Now we're going to see only on Sunday's daf, which on Lamed Daled, which is no one's a Nazir, and this is a famous shita of Rabbi Tarfon we saw in Nedarim, which is lo nitna nezirut ela lahafla. You can only take on nezirut in a definite manner. None of these people took it on in a definite manner because nobody really knew for sure. I was convinced that it was this person, but it's not 100%. I can never say, maybe I'd say I'm 99.9% sure, but I'm not 100% sure. And to do nezirut, you have to be confident that you have to take on a real acceptance and not based on like a bet type thing. What if that person turns around and walks away the other direction and you never found out who that person was? Ain't no Nazir. Tanakama says you're not a Nazir. Rabbi Shimon Oel, right? Because you never have a way to figure out. So it's a suffix, and you don't have to be a Nazir based on suffix. You might remember we discussed this when it came to the pile. If there's 100 core in the pile, we're going to get back to them. Rabbi Shimon Oel, Yomal, imaya kidvarai hareini Nazir chova, v'imlat hareini Nazir netava. Rabbi Shimon says, you would say, if what I said came true, then, and if I was right, then I'm a Nazir because I'm obligated. And if not, I'll take upon voluntary nezirut. And that way, right, suffix, you have to be a Nazir, basically. So resolve it in this manner. So now the Gemara starts off with Beit Hillel, which really made no sense. Misha lo nitkaimu dvarav, amai habi Nazir. Why would you be a Nazir if it wasn't true? You said, I'll be a Nazir if I'm right, and you were wrong. So why would you be a Nazir? First answer we'll see in today's daf, and this will finish today's daf. Amar Rav Yehuda, ema misha nitkaimu dvarav. Change it to the opposite. It was a mistake that they said that. It should be whoever's words came true is a Nazir. That's where we're going to end today's daf. Tomorrow we'll see what Abaya says. As I mentioned, tomorrow is a very, very short daf. And in fact, let's just do a quick review. So the first part we already reviewed. The second part was this case of the animal and the Beit HaMikdash and something changing the whole issue with nolad. We saw that in the end, Rabbi Eliezer agrees with the rabbis. Then we saw this, you can't do nolad, but you can do t'nai nolad. Exactly how that is, it was a little bit unclear. And then we have Rav Yosef who says, I would have suggested something else that they could have anticipated, but we reject that. Then we have our Mishna about these 6 people. We have 3 opinions. Beit Shamai says everybody's a Nazir. Beit Hillel says only one who we're not sure really, because he says only the one who didn't come true. Then the Gemara says, wait, maybe Rav Yehuda suggests maybe he meant what we would have expected, the ones who did come true. Like I said, tomorrow we'll see a second reading of what Beit Hillel means. And then Rav Yehuda, and then we had the last part of the Mishnah, which is if somebody turns, the person who they were talking about disappears and we never find out who it is, are you not a Nazir? Because that's a Nazir out of doubt. And remember that whole theory, you never would have taken upon nezirut in a doubt, if it would have been a doubtful situation, because the doubt is worse than the vadai. Anyway, that's what it seems like the first opinion is, and the Rabbi Shimon says, take it upon yourself, either as chovah or as voluntary. Okay, with that, we'll finish today's daf. And like I said, Shabbat daf is really short. We'll end here for today. Shabbat shalom to everyone.